Thank you so much to both Eva and Morgan, who have been amazingly inspirational leaders of the Trans Task Force for several years. So thank you all for coming today to the 5th Annual Nicholas Papadopoulos Lecture. My name is Susan Marine. I'm Assistant Dean of Harvard College for Student Life and Director of the Harvard College Women's Center, where all genders are welcome. We are gathered here today to pause and reflect on the current state and evolution of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights movement and its history. Today's lecture by Shannon Price-Minter will provide an opportunity to consider how far we have come as a community and what remaining work lies ahead. We are grateful for your participation in this conversation. The annual Papadopoulos Lecture is named in honor of Nicholas Papadopoulos, who received his Master's in Science from Harvard in 1977 and his PhD in Engineering in 1980, and worked as an entrepreneur and self-made consultant in the San Francisco Bay Area for 15 short years before passing away in 1994 due to complications from AIDS. Nick was a beloved student at Harvard who finished at the top of his class. Even after Nick's death, his contributions to our community remain today. Nick left one half of his estate to Harvard to establish an endowment to support gay and lesbian studies and activities at Harvard, and the other half to UCLA to establish the lecture in his name, an endowed lecture in gay and lesbian studies. From literally one coast to the other, Nick's generosity allows us the opportunity to celebrate the LGBT community and its allies. It is also worth noting that in the past, this funding has been used to support undergraduates wishing to attend local LGBT-related events and conferences. Much has changed since Nick's time at Harvard, but one thing remains the same. Our strength as a community is made up of the contributions that each of us make toward equality. Nick's contributions during his life and now make invaluable strides toward that goal. We are deeply indebted to him. We're also indebted to the other co-sponsors of today's lecture. In addition to the Harvard College Dean's Office and the Women's Center, this lecture is sponsored by the Trans Task Force, the Harvard Kennedy School LGBT Caucus, the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, Harvard College Girl Spot, Harvard College Blackout, Harvard College Queer Students and Allies, the Committee on Degrees in Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Caucus. Special thanks also to my dear friends and colleagues, Paul McLaughlin and Tim McGarthy, for their partnership and dedication in working with me to help make today's lecture happen. Just as he was a pioneer in his own time, we're confident that Nick would be pleased that we are welcoming Shannon Price-Minter to speak with us today. Shannon Minter is the legal director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights, one of the nation's leading advocacy organizations for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Shannon has been pivotal in several crucial cases representing the deepest fissures of legal policy regarding LGBT people and our rights, including representing Sharon Smith, the partner of Diane Whipple, in 2001, in a wrongful death case due to her death by dog mauling, which resulted in a landmark decision in California that extended tort claims to same-sex domestic partners. Minter was lead counsel for same-sex couples before the California Supreme Court in in-re marriage cases, taking on Ken Starr in the landmark court case, which held that lesbians and gay men have a fundamental right to marry, and that sexual orientation is a suspect classification under the California Constitution. Shannon was also counsel in Strauss v. Horton, the state court challenge to California's Proposition 8. He is the author of Transgender Rights and Family Law for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender People, as well as numerous articles about legal issues affecting our community. He has taught as an adjunct or lecturer at Bolt, Stanford, Santa Clara, Golden Gate, and the University of San Francisco Law Schools. In 2009, he was named one of California's Lawyers of the Year by California Lawyer magazine. In 2008, he was named among 6 Lawyers of the Year by Lawyers USA, and among California's top 100 by the legal publication The Daily Journal. Of his leadership, Liz Seaton, Deputy Legal Director at the Human Rights Campaign, said, "Frankly, it is hard to find a transgender law or policy project, large or small, anywhere in the country that Shannon has not been involved in, advised on, or influenced through his scholarship, education, or advocacy efforts. At the same time, Shannon devotes enormous amounts of time to giving voice to, mentoring, and meeting the daily survival needs of transgender people across the country, end quote. Shannon is a founding board member of the Transgender Law and Policy Institute and serves on the board of Equality California. He received his JD from Cornell Law School in 1993. He is originally from Texas and currently lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Robin Gilbrecht Minter. Shannon's lecture today is entitled, Do Transsexuals Dream of Gay Rights? The Struggle for an Inclusive Queer Movement. Please join me in welcoming Shannon Price Minter.
Oh, Susie, thank you so much. Gosh, that made me sound good. I'm just so glad to be here, and I really want to thank Mrs. Papadopoulos for making this event possible. And I really cannot think of a better way to honor the memory and legacy of Nick than having this annual event, and it's a privilege for me to be part of it. I want to thank all the co-sponsors and all the students and faculty and staff who've invited me, and all of you for showing up. Thank you very much. As a transgender person, I really especially appreciate the fact that the lecture is focusing on transgender rights this year, because the timing of that is really perfect, because it is very likely that the U.S. House of Representatives will, for the first time, be voting on a transgender inclusive version of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, ENDA, or ENLIST, as we sometimes call it, because it's going on and on, in the coming weeks. And if that does happen, that will be a truly history-making moment for our movement. And it's going to be one that reflects, as probably a lot of other historic moments do in our movements and others, a whole lot of internal conflict and struggle that preceded it. And in order for us to get to a point where we can actually present a unified LGBT front. There's no shame in that history of conflict and struggle. I think that we have managed to work through that and overcome a lot of internal dissension is actually quite an accomplishment and something that we should be proud of. But, we can be quite sure that as this bill moves forward, when it moves forward, anti-LGBT groups are going to zero right in on the vulnerable flank, which is the protections for transgender people. And they're going to do so in the most extreme, provocative, and offensive terms that you can imagine. We're already seeing that. It's already happening. Just to give you a little foretaste, here's a little bit from a very recent press release by the Traditional Values Coalition, which describes itself, well, the Southern Poverty Law Center describes it as a hate group, but they describe themselves as the largest non-denominational grassroots church lobby in America. So they say every state will be forced to recognize transgendered and transsexual individuals as part of a protected class. Schools will then be forbidden to reassign any teacher undergoing a so-called sex change because this would be considered discrimination. Thus, children will be trapped in classes taught by men undergoing so-called sex change to become women, and will be taught that that's normal behavior. I mean, that's just a small sample of what we have to look forward to. We're going to be hearing a lot more of that, and it's going to be challenging to hold our ground. But I am pretty confident that today we are united as one movement, and we're not going to allow ourselves to be splintered or divided. And I actually truly believe that, at least as far as this issue is concerned, that we are past the day when we can be manipulated by our opponents into disowning part of our community or perhaps part of ourselves. I do want to note, though, I think it'd be wrong to talk about ENDA without recognizing that our entire country right now is in an economic crisis, and people are lost their jobs or losing jobs, they've lost their homes, and certainly addressing those broader issues of economic survival and economic justice have got to be at the top of the priority list for our nation and our movement too. Our community has supported ENDA for a very long time, for decades now, but we should be supportive of it at this juncture as part of a broader jobs package or economic reform package, because the anti-discrimination provisions aren't going to do us a lot of good if there's no jobs. But that said, the anti-discrimination piece, it's very significant. I mean, there's certainly been very large growth of social acceptance of LGBT people in a lot of parts of the country, but many people in our community are still incredibly vulnerable to employment discrimination. It still has no legal remedy for that in the vast majority of states. And transgender people in particular are just acutely vulnerable. I mean, it's actually impossible, I think, to overstate this. It really is a genuine crisis for the transgender community. The National Center for Transgender Equality just did a very large survey and actually found that employment discrimination is actually a nearly universal experience among the transgender people they surveyed. And they had 97% reporting being mistreated or harassed in some form or fashion at work. And almost half, 47%, had either lost a job or been denied a job directly because of their gender identity, of their transgender status. And those kind of statistics just have a multiple spiraling effect on your quality of life in every respect. And not surprisingly, the survey found that just rates of unemployment and extreme poverty are about twice as high in the transgender community and even higher than that among transgender people of color than in the general population. Those same results just got replicated at the state level in California, almost uncannily. It's almost exactly the same numbers. The other thing that's very striking about transgender employment discrimination is that other types of discrimination now, they tend to be more covert. Employers and others have learned to mask that. But discrimination against transgender people is often just utterly blatant and completely unembarrassed. We've been working to try and pass protections for transgender workers in Maryland this past year. And this Maryland legislator, without the least hesitation, said he wants to make sure that no business would have to have a transgender person working as a receptionist or in any visible position where they could be seen by the public. And then there's so many cases like this, but we worked on one last year with Salt Lake City, fired a transgender woman who had been a bus driver. She had a spotless record, and they fired her because they were afraid that someone might, it hadn't actually happened, but that someone might complain that she was using public restrooms on her bus route, and they thought that her appearance was not sufficiently passable. I mean, the point here is we are still very much with transgender people at a point where people just feel completely comfortable demeaning and dehumanizing transgender people in a way that's actually, quite shocking. But I mean, we see these sentiments still are very common, I think, in the general public. But I do think we've reached a point in the queer movement where transgender people are no longer so deeply marginalized, and it would be very unusual to hear that degree of open discrimination or hostility. But I'm sure some of you recall, just, as recently as 3 years ago, we were still in a bit of a different place. We had 2007, had a few of national organizations decide to go ahead and move forward with the version of ENDA that included protections for sexual orientation only, and they tried to move that forward on their own. But a very interesting thing happened. There was just this outpouring of community protest, and hundreds of state groups and LGBT national groups and allied groups really just went to the mat to stop that non-inclusive bill from going forward. And it was really quite something. I happened to be in D.C. and was doing a lot of work on the Hill at that time, and the congressional staffers and members were just kind of in a state of amazement. It was really kind of a shock and awe situation. I mean, there was really more than 40,000 constituents contacted Congress to protest the exclusion of transgender people from that bill, and nothing like those numbers has ever happened before in our community. So, that bill didn't move forward, and now we're on the cusp of passing an ENDA that will protect people from discrimination both on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. But it has not always been pretty or easy getting ourselves to that place. And I think, for any marginalized community, those kind of intra-group dynamics are going to be very complex. And, to say the least, just even the concept of an LGBT movement, a queer movement, that covers a very wide range of very significant internal differences: age, geography, race, gender, ability, immigration status, education, we're at Harvard, religion, and other differences that are extremely significant. In fact, what I often find is that when I refer to the LGBT community, almost invariably some people object to the use of that term and make the point there is no such thing as the LGBT community, that we're a collection of disparate individuals and groups stratified along all those lines. And I recognize that. I understand that sentiment entirely. I think it has a lot of merit. And I also think it's important that we talk about and refer to the LGBT community as an aspiration, as something that we should choose to create and to build. Like any relationship, building that sustainable, diverse political movement, it requires constant attention and work. This is not an object found in nature. There is nothing called the LGBT movement or LGBT identity that in any way pre-exists our efforts or our intentions to bring it about. Its existence, who's in, who's out, is in no way inevitable or assured. But so those intergroup dynamics, I think they're even more complex when you have like a relatively established movement like the mainstream gay rights movement is, and then on the other hand, a relatively marginalized group like the transgender community, transgender people who are trying to get themselves into that movement. This kind of adds another wrinkle. So, in my remarks to you this afternoon, I want to talk about that dynamic and how it's kind of played out, what it means for our collective political future, and just a little bit what it might mean for each of us individually. So I'm just going to talk about 4 points. First, I want to share a little bit about my own experiences and observations, just as someone who, by the luck of the draw, has just happened to be very involved in efforts to get the mainstream gay rights groups to include transgender people. That's been going on since the mid-1990s and through the present. And just about the tremendous resistance those efforts initially elicited. And second, I want to talk about the strategy, the primary strategy that transgender people ended up, and our allies too, ended up resorting to overcome that resistance. And third, I actually want to address some concerns about that strategy and that response, which I think may have outlived its usefulness in some respects. And then fourth, last, I just want to leave you with some thoughts about possible alternative ways that we might think about transgender inclusion. But first, and sorry, I hope you indulge me on this is my favorite part, I really want to just talk for a minute about the title, Do Transsexuals Dream of Gay Rights? It's because, yeah. Some of you I'm sure recognize, if you're any science fiction fans out there, that title comes, it's an allusion to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, a wonderful novel by Philip K. Dick that was the basis for the movie Blade Runner. The movie was 1982, and the novel was written in the late 60s. And the novel features a bounty hunter, set in some imaginary post-apocalyptic near future. So the main character is a bounty hunter whose job is to hunt down androids who have escaped and are pretending to be human. They look human. They're kind of mixing and mingling with the human population. And he does that literally by administering this test. He has a little machine. And the test is supposed to be foolproof because the only measure of that is perfectly circular. Anybody who fails the test is automatically an android and then marked for death. It's clear if you read the novel that Dick intended the novel to be, in part, an allegory for the witch hunts by the federal government targeting especially gay men in the 40s and 50s and on through the actually early 60s. And if anybody who's looked at that period knows the FBI in that period actually tried to develop a machine to test whether somebody was gay. They never came up with anything, but it was referred to colloquially as the fruit machine. So in the movie version, Blade Runner, Harrison Ford plays a bounty hunter who, unbeknownst to himself until the end of the movie, of course, turns out to be an android himself, even though he has spent his entire life hunting down and killing androids. It just really evokes in a very rich way the kind of atmosphere and dynamics of, you know, paranoia and misrecognition and that attended the sort of witch hunts in the 50s, and that may be almost endemic to gay and trans identity both, because they're invisible, they're not hidden. So it, you know, really exacerbates this kind of am I or you, who knows, and this kind of mirroring and a constant projection and misrecognition. So it's a wonderful allegory of what happens, you know, when we set out to persecute and exclude the other, that we invariably end up chasing down these disowned parts of ourselves. The unfortunate part there is that the damage that we do, that we inflict on other people is, you know, is quite real. And we see this played out all the time with, it never fails that the most virulent anti-gay politicians always, you know, eventually it's disclosed that they're quite likely to be gay. So I thought this was an apt analogy for this talk, the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, for a couple of reasons. And, you know, one is that people who oppose equality for LGBT people have for a long time now, and they're not giving it up, argued that gay rights, so-called gay rights, are not real civil rights, that they're special rights, that they're not legitimate, that this is not a legitimate extension of the civil rights movement or the civil rights concept. And gay people have been, and still are to some extent, really on the defensive to prove that they're a sort of worthy minority group, and especially after the Supreme Court's decision, devastating decision in Bowers versus Hardwick in 1986, you know, where the court held that the very notion that gay people might have a constitutionally protected right to sexual freedom, the court described that as facetious, as, you know, literally a joke. It's just, I'm sure a lot of you have heard this story, but it really plays into the framework here, this kind of hiding and paranoia. Justice Powell, who was the swing vote on that case, and who was really wavering between which way to vote, and ultimately decided to vote with the majority to uphold the Georgia sodomy statute challenged in the case, said to his chief clerk as he was debating this, you know, I've never met a gay person. And of course, you know how this story ends. The chief clerk was gay, but did not disclose that to Powell, was afraid to disclose it to him at the time. And there was agonized ever after about whether it possibly would have made a difference. But, you know, the point here is just that gay people have had to fight very hard to establish sort of the authenticity of their entitlement to gay rights, just to basic human rights. And so gay rights are presumptively, in this framework, kind of like electric sheep. You know, they're presumptively unreal in the eyes of many people. And then the second reason I'm drawn to this title is because, you know, transsexual people quintessentially are seen as having an identity that is not real. You know, many people see transsexual people, and I think this is still very prevalent in the general public, as delusional, as deceptive, as trying to pass themselves off as something they're not. Many people believe that transgender people are impersonating a man or impersonating a woman the same way an android and Blade Runner, the androids in Blade Runner impersonate real people. And that deception in the eyes of some people is seen as sufficient reason actually to kill them. Brandon Tina is one of the most well-known examples of transgender people who were killed just simply for being themselves. Because his life and death were memorialized in the film Boys Don't Cry. Perhaps people have heard of some other recent cases. Gwen Arajo, a transgender teenager, trans woman who was murdered by 4 young men in Northern California a few years ago when they discovered that she was transgender, and beat her to death over the course of several hours with a shovel and buried her in the desert. And then just last year, 18-year-old Angie Zapata in Greeley, Colorado, was bludgeoned to death in her apartment by a man who claimed that he had not known that she was transgender. So it seemed like to me there was something very apt about the title, Do Transsexuals Dream of Gay Rights? Because part of what I'm trying to suggest is that, you know, if gay people are queasy or uneasy about having to own transgender people as part of their movement, I think that is in part because gay people themselves have had to fight so hard, you know, to establish their own humanity. So it's actually quite understandable in some ways that the gay movement would feel very embattled and not wildly enthusiastic about being asked to embrace this even more marginalized group. But I'm also trying to make the point that it is imperative that gay people not inflict the same harm they've endured on another, even more vulnerable group, and even more specifically that, if gay people feel uncomfortable with transgender people, it might be because trans people kind of embody and just thematize this whole set of issues that are extremely sensitive for many gay people around gender and gender nonconformity. And, one of the ways that gay people have been demeaned is by, being seen as not proper men, not proper women, by that stereotype that gay men are inherently feminine or that lesbians are inherently masculine or butch. In the kind of classic Freudian perspective, lesbians either hate men or they want to be men. And then, in turn, and this may be less familiar to gay folks, transgender people, especially in the medical history, have always got to prove, historically this has changed a lot, but in the past had to prove to therapists in order to get access to treatment that you weren't just gay and you weren't just a gay person who couldn't deal with it. And there are still plenty of people out there who fundamentally do not believe that transsexual identity exists and that all transsexual people are simply lesbians or gay men who cannot accept or deal with their homosexuality. So I think it's really astonishing that the relations between trans people and gay people are, so charged and so fraught. In the most literal way you can imagine, each is like the abjected image of the other. And I think the fact that under those circumstances, I really just cannot imagine more explosive circumstances. The fact that we have been able to actually see one another across that divide and actually kind of imagine what the world would look like through one another's eyes is astonishing. It's a remarkable achievement, and even if it hasn't been perfectly accomplished. So to jump into my first topic there about, so what happened, how did trans people manage to get into the contemporary gay movements? I don't think, anybody should be surprised under those circumstances that it was just incredibly difficult and intense. And I just want to share a few of my firsthand experiences with that. Again, just by luck of the draw, our life circumstances, I happened to be one of the first people who was already working in one of the national LGB at that time organizations. There's one other person, at least I know of, who transitioned before I did in another organization and had a terrible experience and has never wanted to discuss it publicly. So I'm not the first person, and there may be even others, but I was, was one of the first. It was about, it was 15 years ago. It was in the mid-90s, and, I was born female. I was born in Texas, raised as a girl, spent most, or a big chunk of my adult life identifying, not very comfortably, but nonetheless, identifying as female, and identifying, again, not with perfect comfort, as a lesbian for a long time. That's how I ended up working at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. And I knew nothing. I knew virtually nothing about transgender issues. One of the reasons that I actually have a lot of patience and to some degree sympathy for those who initially are not supportive of transgender people is that I could not have been more terrible myself. I was horrible. I very distinctly remember sitting around in the early to mid-'80s with my sister, who was a lesbian, and our lesbian friends, just cheerfully saying horribly derogatory things about transgender women and having these conversations about how there was no way a person who was born male could possibly become a woman or really become a woman or understand what it was like to live as or be a woman. And then not that much later than that, again around the mid-'80s, I was in grad school in Ithaca and involved in passing a local non-discrimination ordinance in this little upstate New York town. And one of our community members had just moved there from Berkeley and was saying to us, hey, we've got to include gender identity and transgender people in this bill. That was the first time I had ever heard those words. I think I was somewhat circumspect in what I articulated at the time, but I can tell you what was going through my head is, what in the world are you talking about? I don't know what that is. know what this weird stuff is, but we've got to get serious and pass this, sexual orientation bill. So it surprises me not at all that we have met with the response that we have. And then just a little bit more about my personal stuff, then I'll move on from that. But my last year of law school was 1993. I saw the documentary that for the first time introduced me to the concept of female to male transgender people. It was Female Misbehavior by Monica von Troy, if anybody, she's a German lesbian filmmaker, and there was a little segment in there about a female to male transsexual, Max Wolf. Later I actually got to meet him and know him, but I was completely transfixed. Max was talking there about his personal experience of taking testosterone and just the physical changes, psychological changes, and I was absolutely obsessed with that documentary and wanted to stop talking about it. But I was still enormously defensive, and if somebody would suggest to me, hey, you seem really interested in this, do you think that maybe you're transgender? I'd be like, come on, no, can a person have an interest in a topic? Of course not. Come on. And then, I did start to wonder, even after a while, so I was like, yeah, okay, this is kind of unusual. And then I was just in this state of like, no, there's no way. I mean, it's just the last thing that I would ever think would happen or be true, and that I thought to myself, I can't possibly be transsexual. If I was, I would know it. I wouldn't be so conflicted and ambivalent and frightened and uncertain. And then I went to hear a lecture by James Green, who is a very well-known leader in the transgender community and has written some wonderful books and articles, and he happened to be reading that night from an unpublished memoir about his own experience of transitioning, and he talked about how conflicted and scared he was, and that he had started taking testosterone and then became completely freaked out and stopped and started again. And I literally left that lecture that night thinking, okay, well, that's it. I'm transsexual. If conflict and ambivalence is part of the deal, then I'm there. So, that was just my personal struggle, though. But, there was this giant political dimension to this as well, because I worked for the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and this was in 1995-96, and at that time, the idea of transgender inclusion in queer organizations was, barely even a glimmer in anyone's eyes. So I talked to my boss, told her about the situation. I told her if there was going to be a big public kerfuffle over this, that I would much rather just leave quietly and not have this become an issue. But to her, enormous credit, she knew nothing about these issues either. She just took on the task of explaining me to the board and to the world and sticking up for my right to be there, and somehow managed, even in that time, to make it seem like just the most natural thing in the world that the legal director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights was becoming a man. I still don't quite know how she did that. But after some adjustment, it was fine. But it was a very stressful experience. I mean, like a lot of other LGBT people, had a very difficult time with my family when I came out. I was estranged from them for many years. Certainly experienced what Sarah Schulman has described as familial homophobia in a wonderful new book, Ties That Bind. I'd worked really hard to build a new community for myself, try to find some sort of home in the queer movement, and the prospect of being kicked out of the nest again was truly frightening, and I think this is true for a lot of other transgender people. And I hope you don't mind. I just want to share you again. I think this is so funny. I had this dream at the time. It was just one of those dreams that you're just never going to forget, where I walked up on a little litter of kittens, and I was like, oh, that's so great. Look at this adorable little litter of kittens, and I'm bending down to pet these little kittens. Now I'm looking closer, and I'm like, hey, one of these kittens, it was a little rat. It's a little rat pretending to be a kitten and doing this amazingly good job of kitten-like behavior and stuff. In the dream, I thought, that is one ingenious little, resourceful little rat. So you can tell I was having some anxiety about getting kicked out of the litter. But at that very same time, not coincidentally, and we could maybe talk about why this all happened timing-wise in the Q&A if we have time. But a lot of other transgender people were just coming out of the woodwork and started to challenge their lack of inclusion and representation in the queer movement. And just again, at that time there was not a single queer national organization that included transgender people or issues in its mission statement or its work, or that recognized those issues as part of the queer political or legal agenda. So there was this really intense 5 years, this period of time from like 1995 to 2000, when the question of whether that was going to change was very much up in the air. And there were pitched battles and just an enormous amount of resistance by lesbian gay organizations and leaders to including transgender people. And I'm saying lesbian gay and not lesbian gay bisexual very purposefully, because bisexual organizations and leaders, they were among the very first people to really welcome transgender people and kind of make common cause as another marginalized group. I think one of the most powerful actions, thinking back on those years, was that the annual Creating Change, this big LGBT political conference. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it and probably been to it, in 1996. So during the main plenary, we had this big action where some of us took the stage and asked all the bisexual and transgender people in the audience to stand up. And it turned out to be a lot. It was like a 25% of the audience. So it was really this very powerful visual, demonstration that, hey, we're just some little marginal splinter group here, but actually a significant part of the community. And Carrie LaBelle of the task force deserves a lot of credit for being the first national ED to come out very strongly in support of transgender people. And the task force, was I think the first group, and then PFLAG shortly thereafter, and NCLR too, of course, to embrace transgender people. So, during this time period, I was part of all these conversations with EDs and along with other transgender people, with EDs and boards. I think just about every one of the national political and legal organizations. We're in there trying to make our case for transgender inclusion. And I will tell you, especially initially, those conversations were just torturous for everyone involved. I mean, the gay leaders, they just genuinely did not understand what we were doing there or what was the basis of this claim. And just to give you one example, there was a very early meeting in 1995 with a bunch of transgender people who were meeting with the leadership of one of the large, political gay organizations and saying, hey, we really want you to expand INDA to include transgender people. And the response was, no, we sympathize with your situation. We don't think transgender people should be discriminated against, but we're a gay organization. It would be like advocacy malpractice for us to expand this bill to include you guys, because that's going to make things a lot harder. And we deal with lesbian, gay, and maybe bisexual people, but you are a separate group. You're transgender, and that's a different thing, and you're not part of our community. And if we bring you into this, you're going to drag us down. No pun intended there. And this was not particularly, it wasn't malicious or mean-spirited. It was just genuine lack of comprehension as to the basis of our claim here. Now, eventually, every single, and it happened pretty quick, it happened in that 5-year period, every single national LGBT political and legal group changed their mission statements and formally embraced the commitment to transgender inclusion. But those changes did not come without controversy, some of which, lingers on and continues. As recently as 2006, Chris Crane, who some people may remember, was the editor of the Washington Blade. He actually was a graduate of Harvard Law School, I believe. And he published this very, at the time, inflammatory editorial in the Blade called INDA Gets Transjacked. INDA Gets Transjacked. And this was shortly after HRC had really come on board with supporting a transgender inclusive INDA. And Chris Crane argued that HRC's mind-boggling decision is wrong politically, legally, and morally. If HRC and these other groups have their way, workplace protection for gays and bisexuals will be held hostage until a majority in Congress and the President agrees to protection for transgendered employees. So in fact, that was 2006. Next year was when some of the groups made a play to move forward with a sexual orientation only bill, and the community just exploded. So even though that was painful, it actually ended up demonstrating that there was a very solid basis of a foundation of solidarity there. Okay, so turning to part 2 of this. So in the face of that intense resistance, what did we do? What did transgender people and allies do to get ourselves, in the door here? So, we were under this tremendous pressure in the face of this just incomprehension to come up with some compelling reason to persuade gay people to see transgender people as part of their movement. So what folks started to do, transgender people and allies, is to reframe gay identity as part of this larger transgender umbrella. It's like, oh, you don't want us in your group? Well, guess what? We're actually the umbrella group, and gay people are a part of some transgender continuum. So people started to argue that lesbians and gay men are not discriminated against primarily because of sexual conduct or sexual desire, but because same-sex relationships themselves inherently challenge gender stereotypes and gender hierarchies. And I'm sure this is very familiar to everyone because it caught on really fast. So Kate Bornstein, has argued that when a gay man is bashed on the street, it has little to do with imagining the man having sex with another man. She was a little more graphic than that. It has a lot to do with seeing that man violate the rules of gender in this culture. And then Gabriel Rotella, this was a big piece in The Advocate, made a big splash at the time, argued that homophobes don't hate us for how we make love. They hate how we make love because it violates expected gender roles. So he argued that all gay and transgender people occupy places on a continuum between the two main genders. And the root of our difference is not merely how we make love, but the larger fact that we exist between the two genders in a variety of ways, some sexual, some not. This idea, he said, has immense implications because if the ultimate cause of our oppression is gender transgression, then shouldn't it be the focus of our identities and our movement? Shouldn't we stop being the les, bi, gay, trans, whatever movement with a new syllable added every few years, and has happened, hasn't it? And simply become the trans movement? So, you get the picture, instead of being this small, marginalized group that's kind of hanging around the edges of the gay movement with this kind of questionable claim to affiliation, transgender people just reinvented themselves as the vanguard of a new queer movement based on this new framework of gender transgression. Now, I'm not suggesting that this position is universally accepted, but it gained a lot of traction in a relatively short amount of time, and I've been amazed by the number of lesbian, gay, bisexual people who this frame really resonates with them. I think it is really common now for people, not universal, but common, for people to assume that what unites LGBT people in one movement is we have some sort of common resistance to gender stereotypes and the gender binary. And this has led to a lot of good stuff. It's a very powerful analysis. It really illuminates a lot of things that were otherwise sort of in the dark. And all kinds of great activism and scholarship focusing on parts of the community that previously were very much marginalized. Butch femme relationships, drag kings, female masculinity, and now just this explosion of genderqueer and transgendered identities. But redefining all the queer movement under the rubric of gender transgression also has some limitations and dangers, and that's what I want to turn to now. So if anybody's paying attention, this will be part 3. And here, I think this analogy fascinates me. I think that what transgender advocates did, as I just described, is very similar to something that happened before. It's very similar to the strategy adopted by some lesbian feminists back in the 70s when the mainstream women's movement was very not interested in including lesbians on its agenda. This is going back a ways, obviously, but Betty Friedan founded the National Organization for Women. A lot of other mainstream feminist leaders refused to recognize lesbianism as a legitimate feminist issue, refused to recognize lesbians as a legitimate constituency within the feminist movement. Friedan, very notoriously called lesbians the Lavender Menace. So guess what T-shirts I and other trans people were marrying in the 90s, transsexual men, of course. And, she really feared that letting lesbians into the movement would undermine the power and credibility very much as the mainstream gay movement felt about transgender people. So, in response, some lesbian feminists undertook what one scholar has called a stunningly efficacious revisioning of same-sex desire as being at the very definitional center of gender. Women who loved women were seen as more female than those whose desire crossed boundaries of gender. Now, this is a brilliant strategy. I mean, that strategy rejected the sort of dominant view of lesbians as just a small group engaging in this deviant sexual practice that was perceived to be by many people male or kind of mimicking masculinity. It was completely flipped around. Instead of this marginalized little unwelcome group, lesbians became women-identified women and argued, it's very well known, that all women are on a lesbian continuum, that any sort of positive interaction between women taking energy and attention away from men, regardless of whether it was sexual, should be conceptualized on this lesbian continuum. And that this woman-identified woman was a manifesto written by a group called Radical Lesbians in 1970, distributed during a Lavender Menace protest at the Second Congress to Unite Women in New York, 1970, a major feminist event. And, a group of lesbians took the stage, expressed their anger about being excluded from the movement, and passed out this manifesto arguing that, far from being this little marginalized group, that lesbians were at the very center and the forefront of women's struggle for women's liberation, and that that it was absolutely essential to the achievement of the goals of the women's movement that lesbians be included. Very similar, although ours was a little less dramatic, to the 1996 Creating Change, taking the stage. And this was a really powerful intervention at the time, and I think it's really important. But it did turn into, over time, a pretty rigid and essentialist position that started to define lesbianism and lesbian feminism. And obviously I'm generalizing here, this is not everyone, but this was a strain and a powerful one of lesbian feminist theory, solely in opposition to men and without a lot of attention to the impact of class or race. And then that led some lesbians to start, I think, misfocusing their anger on other oppressed groups, focusing on heterosexual women and bisexual women who supposedly were, sleeping with the enemy, working class lesbians who identified with, had butch femme identities, gay men who were deemed by some to be even more male, and thus even more loyal to masculinity and male supremacy than straight men, and above all, the most demonized group by this strain of activism and theory were transsexual women. And Janice Raymond and Mary Daly stand out probably as the most kind of vociferous about demonizing transsexual women. It's just the epitome of male privilege and misogyny, and compared transsexualism to necrophilia and rape was seen as this invasion, men invading women's space in the most dramatic way possible. And this, I think, probably a lot of people are familiar with kind of that vein of lesbian feminism, but I think it's less well known that Raymond and Daly actually launched a full-scale political attack on the clinics that provided medical services to transgender people in the late 70s and early 80s, and unfortunately the right wing was targeting those clinics at the same time, and so they're gone. I mean, that was the end of those clinics. And then their very disparaging views of transsexual people, especially transsexual women, they got picked up by a lot of young feminists, discussed in feminist support groups on college campuses, and really came to permeate a lot of lesbian culture, including, that was the source of my conversations with my lesbian sister and our lesbian friends in the 80s. That's what we were doing. We were reading Raymond and Mary Daly and being very affected by it. And I think, to this day, those analyses of transsexualism that Raymond and Daly put forward really continue to influence many lesbians' perceptions of transgender people. And it hasn't been harmful just to transgender people. Also, it's causes a lot of problems for butch lesbians and basically anyone in the community who doesn't conform to what is really a largely kind of white middle class model of what constitutes an acceptable way to be female, to be a woman identified woman. So I mean, it is just the height of irony in a way that transgender people are now borrowing that same political strategy that led to their demonization by certain parts of the lesbian community in the first place. It's just from going from being this outside group to being the vanguard by claiming, in the case of lesbians, to be like the essence of female identity and feminism. In the case of transgender people, by claiming that transgender people are really like embody the essence of gayness, which redefined now as some sort of gender transgression. So that, that's beyond that kind of painful irony. I think we should just be concerned that if we redefine the queer movement primarily through the lens of gender nonconformity, and again, this happened in an effort to position transgender people at the forefront of the gay movement, to get into the movement, we're going to miss a lot. We're going to miss the extent to which other factors like race and class, again, geography, age, ability, national origin, other things are equally, if not more central, both to the way that people actually experience and understand their identities and to like the specific problems and issues that they face. But there's another problem as well, particularly for transgender people and particularly for transsexual people. Because the transgender activist community was so focused on trying to persuade the gay movement to include us, we've really emphasized that many lesbian, gay, bisexual people are gender nonconforming. So, talked a lot about butch lesbians, feminine gay men, drag kings, drag queens, but we have tended to downplay transsexual people because that is the hardest identity for gay people to understand or accept. It is the most remote. And transsexual identity doesn't necessarily fit that well within a gender nonconformity, gender transgressive framework. In fact, a lot of people, and still feminist scholars and lesbian feminist scholars, think just the opposite, that transgender or transsexual people are reinforcing gender stereotypes. So it's had this very kind of paradoxical effect that inadvertently, by focusing so much on gender nonconformity, we've kind of rendered transsexual people a bit invisible now, and it's making it difficult to see the specific issues that transsexual people have. And that's, it shows up in a lot of specific ways. Just most basically, I think that at least some LGBT people are uncomfortable with the medical aspects of sex reassignment, or even with the idea that people want to go through sex reassignment. I think it's almost to the point where all one needs to do these days is invoke the medical model or medicalizing this or that, and that has become a bad word. That has become, presumptively something that we should not support. You see it too in the bathrooms. It comes out so clearly with the issues relating to bathrooms, because what a lot of genderqueer, gender nonconforming people want generally is access to gender neutral bathrooms. Then on the other hand, what a lot of transsexual people want, and again I'm overgeneralizing, but many transsexual people are primarily seeking access to the bathroom that conforms to their gender identity, and the notion that for some transsexual people that they would have to go to a gender neutral bathroom is actually very, very upsetting. There's actually a kind of a real difference of interest, and potentially even a clash there, that I think we're just starting to come to grips with. And then, I feel bad, but I don't mean to pick on Judith Halberstrom for this at all, because I actually think this article she wrote was very good. But, a few years ago, she got in a bit of hot water for writing an article where she, made the claim we're all transgender. And I actually think she was making a very important point. There is absolutely a sense in which that is correct, that no one perfectly inhabits gender norms, and yes, in that sense, we are all transgender. In another sense, however, taken too far, that concept makes it impossible to kind of get a handle on the specificity of transgender and even more specifically transsexual identity, you know, is so similar to, I mean, we've seen this almost exact thing before with some lesbians, Joan Nessel, Biddy Martin, and others, you know, criticizing eventually the notion of a lesbian continuum by saying, you know what, it's just, yeah, it's become too abstract, and we've now kind of lost sight of the fact that of lesbianism in the sense of women who have sex with other women. So that's that takes me to fourth, and I'm sure you're glad here, you know, last point. I was talking with a colleague about, you know, having the chance to come talk to you guys, and I was like, you know, I'm really excited about this because, you know, it's a rare opportunity to get to talk to Harvard students and Harvard faculty, and I mean, by definition, you guys are brilliant, and by definition, you know, every single person in this room is in a position of incredible influence and power, and has an amazing capacity to really help or hurt transgender people. And I was really agonizing about this because and I was discussing this with my colleague, and I'm like, you know, I want to share this concern and critique I have about the imposition of this sort of universalizing gender transgressive framework, because I do think it served a purpose, but I think we're now in danger of taking it too far and losing sight of the specific needs and interests of transgender people. But the dilemma it left me with, and it does leave me with, is if I cannot say to you all, and those of you who are not transgender, that transgender issues and identity are at the very center of gay identity, why should you care? You know, why should gay people, lesbian, gay, bisexual people support transgender people or care about their issues? And, you know, anybody in this room, I am quite sure, could immediately come up with a list of reasons why, you know, there are many trans people who identify as lesbian, gay, and bisexual. There are even transgender people who come out and then identify as straight. Many, not all, come through the sort of queer community and maintain an affiliation with the queer community. We certainly have common opponents, common enemies. I think it's true that when we advance, you know, understanding or legal protections for one group, it tends to advance them for the other. But really, at the end of the day, I do not think that any of those interest-based sort of reasons really get at the most compelling reason for gay people or anybody to care about transgender people. I think that is the opportunity. The reason is there is an opportunity to have a genuine encounter with difference. You know, and to learn something new, genuinely new, about the varieties of human experience, and open ourselves up to something actually truly new and different and strange. You know, there's a great scene in the movie Blade Runner where the android Roy, who's played by Rutger Hauer, he says to the bounty hunter Harrison Ford, "If only you could see what I've seen with your eyes. You know, if only you could see what I've seen with your eyes." I love that line, but, you know, literally it refers to the fact that Harrison Ford works for the company that made Roy's body, because Roy's an android, including his eyes. But, you know, I think metaphorically it also refers to the fact that, you know, we can only see through the limits of some sort of shared framework or shared sociality, and, you know, we're always in a shared social, cultural, material matrix, even though, you know, our positions in that matrix can be so different. And then later in the film, this is a bit over the top, but Roy says, you know, "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. C-beams glittering off the Tannhauser Gate, attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. All these things will be lost when I go." He's sad, he's dying, and these things he's saying, you know, will be gone. And so, of course, Roy's fear and grief about his mortality is, you know, what proves in the book and in the movie as well that he's just as human as anyone else. And the point here, the similar point here, is definitely not, that transgender people or androids are the only ones with some kind of strange new visions to offer. And I'm trying to say just the opposite, you know, that we've all seen things that no one else has seen, and, you know, we all have our own versions of these C-beams glittering off the Tannhauser Gate, whatever in the world that's supposed to mean. And that's what we miss. That is what we miss out on when we mistakenly reduce our politics to some universal frame, whether it's sexual orientation or gender transgression or anything else. And being open to encountering that kind of genuine difference or strangeness, I think, is so much more interesting ultimately than just ceaselessly encountering over and over again. It's kind of our own disguised projections. Whether those take the form of demonizing gender difference along the lines of the traditional values coalition, or of idealizing gender transgression as somehow being the universal key to queer identity, or in Gabriel Rotello's words, the ultimate cause of our transgression. So, I think the most profound form of respect that we could pay to one another is just to be genuinely curious about each other's lives. And I'll just leave you with the thought that, I think nothing is likely to yield us greater personal rewards than that, or to provide a better platform for collective political empowerment and solidarity. So I really appreciate you all inviting me and letting me share my crazy little visions of C-beams and attack ships on fire. And I very much look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks very much.
Hi.
Oh, Sarah.
I have a bumbling, naive question, but feel free to ask it.
Oh, good. Go easy on me now.
So what I'm perceiving in my own life right now is that lesbians and trans men are morphing into one community. And it's a community of friendship, it's an erotic community, it's a political community. My perception is that's not happening with gay men and trans women. And I'm wondering if that's true, and if you have an understanding of what that's about.
I love that question, actually. You know what I see happening? I definitely think that is right, that there is a community of lesbians and trans men who are just kind of merging into one social group. And like you said, interacting socially, erotically, romantically, and all that. I just don't think, what I don't want us to lose sight of is there is definitely, trust me, another group of transsexual men who are not remotely related politically, socially, in any way you can think of culturally to that whole scene. That's part of what I'm worried about. I mean, it's just so stark in the advocacy we do that there's an entire group of the transsexual community who has no voice. The way we have set this up, the way that we frame transgender inclusion in the gay rights movement, it is this group, the merged lesbians and FTM group, they're covered. This other group of transsexual, both men and women, who are off doing very different things and have very different problems, are really almost completely unrepresented, and we only ever run into them when somebody has a legal problem, and then we're bringing a case on behalf of, somebody who transitioned when he was 18, married for 15 years, has kids, is living in a community where no one knows he's transsexual. This is a very different world than this other world. That's one thing. But to your other question about our gay men and transsexual women, I'm starting to see signs of that, yeah. I don't know if anyone, it's not nearly as pronounced or developed as the lesbian FTM connection, but I don't know if anyone has seen the show, I don't even know, it's on some cable station where it's produced by gay men where these 3 transsexual women give fashion advice to women. Yeah. I'm starting to see cultural production sort of connections like that happening. I don't know where that's going to go.
Why do you think they're different? That's really not my question.
Oh, why is there a difference? I am not sure. I think it's almost like an interesting sociological question about why butch, maybe it's just sexism, I'm thinking. I don't know, but why masculine women and butch lesbians have, at least from what I can tell, been a more visible accepted part of the lesbian community than feminine gay men. But I don't know. I don't know, maybe somebody else has a thought about that.
Yeah, I think you're getting there. I think gay men's worst nightmare, at least early on in the generations of gay men that I'm familiar with, was to be thought of as effeminate. And so it's something to run away from, not toward. I don't see that as strongly among lesbians I know, that they would run away from the idea of being thought masculine. I mean, that's,
Yeah.
but I wanted to actually
Oh, okay.
ask a question
Yeah.
at the risk of sounding as if I'm trying to invent a fruit machine for transsexuals. It seems to me that not all trans people are gender nonconforming and gender challenging. That in fact, if someone is a man without a penis, then he's a man.
Mm-hmm.
And he wouldn't necessarily share any kind of common interest except in being the fact that you're commonly marginalized or that there's a stigma. It's like we're united by stigma. And so we understand, but that doesn't just revolve around gender and sexuality. That can revolve around race, class, religious,
Absolutely.
any kind of stigma. We can understand stigma. We know what it is to be marginalized or socially constructed, often, differences. So I can see having an LGBT movement that would include the T's who are gender nonconforming,
That's
more
kind of,
than those who are living their lives, as you just hinted, a whole other community that's disconnected. And at some point we might, as an LG movement, lose some of the L's and G's who don't really care about being L or G anymore. It doesn't really constitute their identity in any way, and the homophobia has so decreased in the world that there's no reason to be in a community around their sexuality. You see what I mean?
possibly.
It's hit or miss.
But your first point is I could not agree with more. That is the point I am actually trying to make. I've had this experience before in a prior written version that's a little bit of this, and trying to make this point in other context. It's very difficult to make this point about gender nonconformity not being an adequate frame or being leaving people out, or exactly what you said. It really absolutely marginalizes and race and class issues, but it's such a powerful frame that I've often found that when I'm trying to make the point that I do not think we should use it as a universal frame, what people hear me saying is that we should. It's just like it really has a lot of resonance for people, and I think that alone should make us suspicious. If we're so comfortable about an issue that's so difficult and complex, I think we should be very suspicious of that
It's
comfort.
dictated by political exigencies, I think, more than anything else.
Yep. No,
So it's
very good.
reactionary.
It is. Yeah.
Yes, Sarah.
Hi, Sue.
Hi, hon. I just wanted to comment, because I think this is you raise a very interesting point, and I wanted to say two things. That gay male culture, in perhaps its most traditional, and I will say separatist expressions, is very male, as you said, right? And men are weird. And so, the anxiety that men have about being appropriately masculine is an automatic repellent to men who have become women and who express themselves as women. But I also want to point out that there is an entire international organization devoted to bringing together masculine presentation and feminine presentation, the International Court System, which if you don't know about it, you should, because it's But the international court system is an extremely elaborate cultural structure that exists for a couple of reasons. One is to provide space for drag queens who are not trans women for the most part, but who do express their womanness with great frequency and much splendor at events, and also men who remain as male presentation in their participation in the international court activities. And so the Night of 1,000 Gowns in New York, which was just held a couple weeks ago, is one of these most spectacular gatherings of the international court system. So I wanted to bring it up because there are places and spaces where gay men and women presenting men not only come together and hang out, but they raise incredible amounts of money for community organizations, and particularly a huge fundraiser around each communities.
Yeah.
Couple things. First, I want to thank you for calling out bisexual activists and organizations in a positive way. That doesn't happen very often. So thank you. I'm one of those people you were talking about. I was thinking about what you were talking about, the internal conflict in our community. I travel around the country, and I've probably been to 60 different places in this country this year. And one thing that I see is there are so many different realities. So the one that you're talking about might be unimaginable somewhere else. And it's amazing to me how differently communities get constructed, and who's in and who's out, and who's welcome, who's allied with who, and who's fighting with who, and who doesn't talk to who, and how it works. It's so different in different places. And I was thinking about what you were talking about, the internal hostility within the idea that, first of all, our community is actually a compilation of communities, right?
Yep.
And I like the way you pose it as an aspiration, that it's kind of some abstract sum of lots of different specific locations and places and politics. And I was thinking about the hostility in our community to those of us who are too different, but also the hostility in our community to those of us who are not different enough, or who are not perceived by other people as different enough. For example, transsexual people who see themselves as gender normative in their new gender, or bisexual people, or the labels that people see as reinforcing the binaries, or, which by the way is all labels, lesbian, gay, straight, and bisexual. But like there's like too pure, not pure enough. We have a lot of stuff going on that's very, very complex.
We do. We have a case right now, actually, that really highlights a lot of stuff we're talking about. I wish we did not have to bring this case, but we did. We're suing a gay softball league for excluding players, 3 players who are bisexual men who were deemed not gay enough to play in this league. And the way the sort of implicit definition of what constituted gay enough was very racialized as well. These 3 men, they're all men of color, and there were these 5 men who were targeted as potentially not being gay enough, and were individually interrogated in a room full of 25 people about their details of their sexual desires and practices and so forth. And even though the men gave similar answers, somehow or other, and they took multiple votes, and different times the vote came out a different way about who was gay or not gay, but at the end of the day it was the 2 white guys were gay enough, and the 3 men of color not gay enough. But yeah, I mean, this stuff is very, it's very real. It's very real. Yeah. But part of what I hope my message is getting through, because part of what I'm trying to urge is that we hold on to each other. That there's no automatic frame that's going to hold us all together, or that is going to work as an automatic default filter. And I just want us to be more adventurous and courageous, and and really see each other as different. We're different, and not be afraid of that. Yeah.
I want to thank you also for your comments. I think your ideas about sort of ultimately what will bind us together are really interesting and important, and it definitely resonates with me, this idea of just being open to different, as you say, difference and strangeness. I know you don't mean strangeness, but.
Yeah, good kind.
Yeah, but it occurred to me as you were tracing this really wonderful sort of connection between sort of the 70s lesbian feminism and the current movement, and I appreciate that you sort of did that in a way that suggested we don't want to go down that road, but I think there are things from that era and that movement that might serve us well, and the primary thing I think that might serve us well is a sort of real commitment to self-determination, which I'm always baffled when I meet any flavor of LGBT person who doesn't resolutely believe that really sort of what we need to be about is total and utter commitment to self-determination. Self-determination of our body, of our sexual practices, of our gender identity, of the whole spectrum. And I meet a lot of LGBT people who are really comfortable judging other people's choices around their bodies, their sexual, And I just think, how do we lose that? Because in the 70s, that really was the mantra of lesbian feminism. It was, I am who I am and I will be who I want to be, and patriarchy will not define that for me. And I really think we need to get some of that back, and we need to tap back into that commitment. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether that is in any way, shape, or form, a useful legal strategy, because it also weirdly resonates with conservatives.
It kind of does sometimes, doesn't it? I think it's a wonderful legal strategy, you bet. I think claiming the right to, not to get into this topic, I know we're going to talk about that in the plenary, but to me that's one of the more progressive avenues into the marriage question, is to see it under the rubric of the right to autonomy and self-definition, and that whole arena of family formation and recognition is so important to a person's identity and fate that the individual and not the state should get to make those decisions. Yeah, I like that. I like your idea. I love your idea actually of self-determination. I think that would be a great model for us. If we think about, if part of what we're trying to do as a community is create a community that actually benefits from, draws upon the different knowledges, experiences, perspectives of as many people as possible, to put that all in the pot to see what we can collectively do together. Like we have a kind of collective capacity for action, for doing new things in the world that we don't even know what they are yet, in terms of both individual self-determination and some kind of collective self-determination. That's really, I'm just kind of about a sort of a radical democracy or something like that. And instead of the zero sum that we have to find the correct, ideological frame and then hold one another accountable against, against that is really debilitating and tiresome, and then we don't even see each other anymore. Yeah, I like that frame a lot, though.
One more question? Anyone? Comment?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question related to, Sarah, the issues that you brought up. I think that, well, first of all, I just want to know, I think it's important not only to think about trans men in relation to queer women's communities and trans women in relation to gay men's communities, because I think a lot of the trans women I know, they
I'm really glad you raised that. Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I'm getting too old. I feel like I'm up here talking about before the internet. This is how it was. But it's true. Like when I first came out as transsexual a long time ago now, trans men were relatively invisible and marginalized inside the transgender movement, and that was like this giant topic of controversy. And there were some wonderful trans women leaders like Phyllis Fry and Susan Stryker who went to extraordinary lengths. I know, I love both of them. Went to these great lengths to increase the visibility of FTMs, and now it is the absolute reverse. Now FTMs are dominating everything, getting the jobs, especially professional movement jobs, just sucking all the resources and sort of visibility away from trans women. I do not exactly know how to account for that, but it is a very serious problem. And I think it's a really good reminder again that none of these things shift. I mean, none of this is set in stone, and I think we just have to stay vigilant about, for any of us, our relative privilege vis-a-vis others is going to constantly contextual and going to be shifting, and you gotta stay alert to not not get caught unawares by that. But it is a really big problem. I wish I had something more constructive to say than that, but I'm glad that you mentioned it. Yeah.
Shannon, let me suggest a possible reason for this. Sexism.
Yep.
Male privilege.
Yep.
And passing privilege.
Masculine privilege.
Yeah, no, passing privilege. I think that trans men are going to inherently pass better on hormones than trans women are without any surgery. And so if that's the case and we don't have a lot of access to economic resources, the job's going to go to the person who feels that everyone else thinks that will fit in better and make less people uncomfortable as the front desk person, as you were saying. So that's a passing privilege about being gender normative in your new gender.
Yep, that may very well be a factor. And then I'm just thinking too that a lot of transgender men that end up with these jobs and the visibility, like myself would be a perfect example, started out in the lesbian community, so we're kind of known quantities and maybe more familiar. And Sarah was noting, you just don't see as many trans women sort of coming through the gay male community. Why this? Yeah, I think they're really important questions that I, for one, do not have the answers to. Yeah. Sexism is always a pretty good bet, though. yeah, definitely. Definitely. Thanks so much, you guys. I've so much enjoyed that discussion, and really, I'm just so honored and privileged to be here, and thank you very much for having me.